For 50,000 years, the border had been quiet. Not peaceful, that word implied intent, but inert. A hard geometric boundary embedded in every modern star chart, tagged with a designation so old most languages rendered it differently. Former human exclusion zone. Inactive. Legacy. Not strategic. The flotilla crossed it anyway. 300 vessels from 14 species slipped across the boundary in a disciplined, layered formation. Survey craft forward. Analysis barges behind them. Escort cruisers formed a loose shell. Not because anyone expected resistance, but because procedures still demanded the shape of caution. Admiral Trek of Consensus watched the border marker vanish from the tactical display without ceremony. No alarms. No spikes. No resistance fields. Boundary crossed, reported the NAV intellect. No anomalous readings. That matched every projection. Humanity had vanished before most current civilizations had discovered hyperspace. What remained, ruins, artifacts, half-decayed probes, had been picked over for millennia. Their territory had been sealed less out of fear and more out of bureaucratic inertia, a warning sign no one had bothered to remove. The galaxy has grown crowded since then. Resource compression, stellar exhaustion, population overflow, every major power felt the strain. Human space, by contrast, sprawled across a dense, resource-rich region no one had touched in 50,000 years. Entire arms of the galaxy left idle because of a species no longer present to object. The consensus had shifted. Historical committees had concluded the same thing again and again. No civilization, no matter how paranoid, could maintain active defenses across such a scale for so long. Automated remnants degraded. Energy sources failed. Maintenance stopped. At worst, there might be traps. Ancient weapons. Dangerous, yes, but finite. That was what the flotilla was here to catalog. Proceed to Phase 1. Tresk ordered. Passive survey only. No activations. No excavation. The fleet advanced. Human space was ordinary. Stars burned steadily. Dust lanes shimmered. A few systems showed faint electromagnetic clutter, the residue of old industry, but nothing alive. Nothing watching. Confidence rippled through the command strata. This matches the models, said Analyst Third Kale. No active traffic. No energy surges. Whatever the humans left behind is dormant. A junior tactician flicked through old threat projections. Their symbols faded with age. They really sealed off half a galactic arm because they were afraid of us. A few mandibles clicked, amusement rippling through the channel. They were afraid of everything, Kale replied. Intelligence without proportional restraint, that was their flaw. The flotilla crossed deeper. For light hours past the border, the forward scouts began detailed stellar scans of the nearest system, a yellow-white main sequence star with 6 planets, 2 in the habitable band. It was flagged as a prime candidate for reclamation, stable, resource-rich, untouched. Survey Team Alpha entering system, came the report. No one objected. Then the star dimmed. At first, it was subtle, a fractional drop in luminosity that barely registered. Sensors adjusted automatically, compensating for what they assumed was stellar variance. Then the gravity spiked. Wait. Kale's voice cut through the channel. That mass increase is impossible. The star's core began to compress. Not collapse naturally, collapse deliberately. Gravitational readings surged past known thresholds. Fusion reactions spiked, then choked as space-time itself folded inward. The star's output plummeted as its mass condensed far faster than physics should allow. Emergency retreat. The tactical officer's voice cracked across all channels. Too late. The star imploded. Not a supernova. Not an explosion. A controlled stellar collapse. Energy drawn inward, not outward, followed by a sharp gravitational rebound that tore the inner system apart. Planets shattered. Radiation fronts rippled outward in a perfectly spherical wave. Survey Team Alpha ceased to exist. 4 escort vessels on the system's edge were torn open by tidal forces before their shields could fully engage. 2 more were dragged off course, hulls screaming as space-time twisted around them. The shockwave reached the main flotilla seconds later. Instruments screamed. Formation fractured. Panic surged through crews whose species had never seen a star die on command. Damage report. Tresk demanded. 6 confirmed losses, came the reply. More unresponsive. The star. Admiral, the star was triggered. Silence followed. Then the data began to arrive. Long-range sensors showed the same signature echoing outward. Not energy leakage, but confirmation signals, racing through the system's debris at light speed. Authentication pulses. Status beacons. This wasn't a trap. It was a report. Analysis, Tresk said slowly. Now, Kale's tendrils trembled as the data was resolved. The collapse followed a pre-engineered sequence. The star was primed, modified at the core level. The trigger was external, but authorization was internal. Meaning the system was designed to destroy itself when entered. A cold realization spread through the command net. This wasn't a defense meant to stop an invasion. It was a denial measure. The border lit up on the tactical display as secondary markers activated, stars highlighted faintly across dozens of neighboring systems, each tagged with similar dormant signatures, now waking one by one. "Admiral," said the NAV intellect, its tone stripped of inflection. "Predictive modeling indicates cascading activation potential across human space." "How far?" Tresk asked. The answer took longer than expected. "If the perimeter fails entirely," the intellect said, "chain reactions could destabilize multiple stellar clusters. Trade corridors adjacent to this region would become non-viable. Gravitational shear may propagate into populated sectors." The implication was unmistakable. Human space wasn't empty because it was abandoned. It was empty because it was armed. And if breached fully, it would not be conquered. It would be erased, taking neighboring regions with it. "Open all channels," Tresk ordered. "Send a withdrawal signal." Before the command could propagate, a new data stream cut through the chaos. Not a transmission. A record. Recovered from the collapse's outgoing signal. A compact, ancient data block, encoded in no fewer than 7 extinct human standards, redundantly layered for one purpose: verification. Kale decrypted it in seconds. It was not a message. It was something worse, a policy file. Designation: perimeter failsafe, status: active authorization, human civil consensus, PRE authenticated condition met, non-human incursion detected. The timestamp was 50,000 years old. The protocol was still running. The emergency council convened less than 3 minutes after the star collapsed. Not from panic. Panic implied uncertainty, but because protocol demanded consensus after unexpected loss. The flotilla had trained for this. Every species present had lost ships before. Catastrophe alone never justified retreat. Admiral Trek of Consensus presided over the hollow conclave as damage reports stabilized. 6 vessels gone. Thousands dead. Tragic, yes, but within acceptable margins for frontier operations. The event was violent. Tresk began, but localized. Analysis is ongoing. That framing mattered. Already, the narrative was forming. Analyst Third Kale displayed layered projections over the shared tactical space, probability cones, decay curves, energy exhaustion models. The stellar collapse mechanism was ancient. Its activation confirms human automation, not human presence. Several delegates nodded. This was important. A living enemy changed everything. A dead one did not. The humans engineered denial systems, Kale continued, but such systems degrade. They are finite. That star was primed long ago, but now it is spent. Exactly, said Delegate Vorin of the Kelt assemblage. A corpse can still twitch. That does not mean it can fight. Several heads nodded, or their species equivalent. The logic was sound. Comfortingly so. No civilization, however paranoid, could maintain an infinite lattice of active escalation for 50,000 years. Power sources failed. Control networks decayed. Redundancy collapsed into entropy. Even the humans, especially the humans, would have understood that. They had feared invasion. They had overreacted. And then they vanished. The perimeter is not a wall, Vorin continued. It is a minefield left unattended. Dangerous only if we assume it is whole. The vote counters ticked upward. One voice dissented. The confirmation signals contradict that, Kale said carefully. The authentication layers were intact. Multi-generational encryption. The system is expected to be tested. A murmur rippled through the council. Expectation implied intent. Admiral Tresk lifted a manipulator. Expectation does not imply maintenance. Pre-programmed responses can persist long after their creators are gone. Another delegate chimed in. And even if more systems are primed, they cannot all trigger simultaneously. That would require coordination. The word hung in the air. Coordination required minds. Humans had none left. That was the assumption underpinning half a galaxy's strategic doctrine. Proceeding deeper allows us to map the threat, Trek concluded. Retreat teaches us nothing. The vote passed. Advance resumed, more cautiously, but still forward. The flotilla was reconfigured. Survey teams pulled back. Heavy escorts moved to the fore. Active scanning intensified, probing the dark between stars for mass shadows and energy traps. They found debris. Human debris. Ancient hull fragments drifting cold and inert. Wreckage fields so old they had become part of the stellar background. Broken megastructures half swallowed by dust. Evidence of self-inflicted destruction on a scale rarely seen. See, Voron's satisfaction was audible. They burned themselves out. This too made sense. The humans had always been unstable, according to surviving records. Excessively aggressive. Recklessly innovative. A species that escalated faster than it could sustain. They had destroyed themselves. The flotilla pushed on. For systems in, the sensors began to pick up anomalies, small ones. Microlensing distortions. Fleeting mass shadows that vanished when focused on. Subrelativistic echoes inconsistent with natural debris. Kale flagged them. These patterns resemble old mines, interrupted a tactician. Unpowered. Drifting. Not drifting, Kale replied. Anchored. The council reviewed the data. The anomalies formed loose geometric lattices across interstellar voids, not dense enough to block passage, not energetic enough to threaten modern shielding. Relics. Clear them, Tresk ordered. At range, long-range pulses swept through the region. Several anomalies detonated harmlessly, small flashes, insignificant. Confidence returned. They are failing, Voron said. Exactly as predicted. The flotilla advanced again. Then space tore open. Not with light, but with absence. A relativistic impact detonated inside the escort formation. No warning, no energy signature until the moment of contact. A mass accelerated to near-light speed crossed the kill zone in silence and punched through a cruiser's core as if it weren't there. The ship vanished. A line of annihilation traced through space where it had been. Another impact followed. Then another. Minefield. The cry echoed across a dozen channels simultaneously. Not drifting. Not decaying. Waiting. Dormant masses embedded in null pockets, masked against detection, awakening only when probability thresholds were met. Bold, but precise. The escort screen disintegrated in seconds. Evasive maneuvers. Tresk ordered. Too late. A carrier group, 36 vessels linked by shared logistics and command, crossed an invisible boundary. The minefield woke up. Hundreds of relativistic projectiles fired in coordinated waves, each strike calculated not just to destroy ships, but to fracture formation coherence. Command vessels were targeted first, relays second, drives third. The carrier Unifying Dawn took a direct hit. Its shields flared, then folded as space-time distortion cascaded through the hull. The ship broke apart, not explosively, but systematically, as if disassembled by physics itself. In the carrier's final nanoseconds, Engineer Second Chess was reaching for a control that would never arrive. Her last thought wasn't fear, there wasn't time. It was confusing. The numbers had been wrong. Humans weren't supposed to still be. 36,000 lives ended in less than a second. Then the command net went silent. The flotilla's central relay, threaded through the carrier, collapsed. Communications fragmented into isolated clusters, each suddenly blind to the others. Restore the link. Tresk demanded. No response. Backup channels failed to handshake. Quantum entanglement relays reported decoherence, not random, but patterned. Someone, or something, had anticipated redundancy and severed it deliberately. Kale stared at the pattern for 15 seconds without speaking, an eternity in combat time. These minds aren't independent, Kale whispered, tendrils trembling against the console. They're synchronized. That was impossible. Synchronization required timing. Timing required clocks. Clocks drifted over millennia, unless someone had accounted for the drift. Unless the system had been designed to fire even if no one was left to watch it. Still, the council clung to logic. This is the last layer, Voron insisted over fractured comms. A perimeter defense. We're through the worst of it. But the losses were undeniable. The Unifying Dawn was gone. 2 escort squadrons were erased. Command authority fractured. Thousands dead. And the human border, far from collapsing, had not yet truly reacted. The flotilla had assumed humanity no longer mattered. That assumption had just cost them a flagship. The first assumption to die was that the defenses were local. In the aftermath of the carrier's destruction, the flotilla reorganized into fractured clusters, each struggling to re-establish coherent command. Emergency relays pulsed. Couriers were launched. Narrowband signals crawled through damaged space-time, slow and unreliable. Yet something else was happening, something no one had ordered. 3 systems deeper into human space, a red dwarf flickered, dimmed, collapsed. Not violently. Precisely. The star's luminosity dropped in a smooth curve, as if following a pre-written equation. Its planets, airless but resource-rich, were swallowed by tidal forces as the stellar mass compacted inward. Within minutes, the system ceased to exist as a navigable location. Coalition sensors flagged it as an anomaly. Then another system followed. Then another. The pattern snapped into focus too quickly to ignore. These are not defensive triggers, Analyst Third Kale said, their voice cutting through the noise of damaged channels. No coalition assets entered those systems. Then what's activating them? Demanded Tresk. The answer arrived in the form of correlation. Each collapsing system lay along projected retreat vectors, routes the flotilla would take if it attempted withdrawal. Others intersected known hyperspace corridors, junctions essential for resupply or reinforcement. Human space was not reacting to intrusion. It was reconfiguring itself. A junior tactician spoke what the others were thinking. They're destroying their own territory. Silence followed. That made no sense. Defensive doctrines focused on preservation. Deny the enemy. Yes, but only where necessary. Civilizations did not burn habitable systems unless they were already lost. Yet these systems weren't contested. Some had never been entered, which meant the destruction was not tactical in the short term. It was shaping. Overlay collapse sites with coalition movement projections, Kale ordered. The display resolved into a chilling geometry. The destroyed systems formed narrowing arcs, their absence hurting the flotilla into fewer and fewer viable routes. Safe space was becoming constrained, not by force fields or fleets, but by missing stars. Human space was turning into a maze whose walls were annihilated. This isn't automation drift, Kale said quietly. It's coordinated. The word landed hard. Coordination meant agency. Not relics. Not decay. Someone, or something, was still making decisions. The council scrambled to respond. Open emergency corridors, Vorin insisted. Punch through before more systems go. Engineers tried. Hyperspace apertures formed and collapsed seconds later as underlying space-time geometry destabilized. The energy profiles matched the earlier stellar collapses, but scaled differently. Precision strikes, not brute force. Every attempt to force an exit narrowed the remaining options. This benefits them, Tresk said, staring at the tactical map. Whoever they are. The benefit was undeniable: containment. Coalition forces were no longer advancing deeper, but neither could they retreat. Supply estimates began to flash amber, then red. The flotilla had brought enough for a survey, not a siege. Still, logic fought to reassert itself. No species would do this to itself, Vorin argued. Not at this scale. These systems, some of them are habitable, resource-dense. They're burning wealth beyond recovery. They must be automated thresholds, another delegate added. Last resort scorched space. Triggered too early. But the data refused to cooperate. Human signatures, faint, ancient, but unmistakable, were embedded in the collapse commands. Not a single universal key, but billions of localized authorizations, distributed and redundant. Each system confirmed destruction independently, yet in perfect temporal alignment. This wasn't a failsafe. It was a choice, executed long ago, but designed to be carried out now. A fragmented transmission finally reached the flotilla from outside the exclusion zone. A coalition observatory on the border, screaming warnings. Gravitational turbulence is increasing, the message stuttered. Trade lanes destabilizing. Your incursion is triggering effects. The cost was spreading outward. Neighboring regions, once considered safely distant, began to experience navigational instability. Shipping routes faltered. Civilian traffic rerouted in panic. Insurance markets crashed within minutes. Human space was not isolated. It was entangled. Every system lost rippled outward, like removing load-bearing beams from a structure no one realized they depended on. They're collapsing the interior to protect the exterior, Kale said, by making it impossible to move through. A cold understanding took shape. Humanity wasn't defending territory. It was withdrawing space itself. The flotilla attempted one final maneuver, a coordinated jump toward the border, forcing power through a corridor before it could destabilize. Drives charged. Timers synchronized. For a heartbeat, it almost worked. Then the corridor ahead flickered and tore. The hyperspace conduit twisted, its exit vector folding back on itself as underlying constants shifted. Ships attempting the jump were flung into real space at lethal velocities or vanished entirely, their signatures smeared across probability space. The corridor collapsed permanently. Engineers confirmed it seconds later. Route integrity failure. Came the report. Space-time topology altered. Corridor unrecoverable. The map was updated. A thick red line appeared where the exit had been. Intraversable. The last clean path back to known space was gone. No reversal was possible. Humanity had not revealed itself with fleets or words, but with absence, with subtraction so deliberate it could only be intentional. The flotilla was no longer exploring human space. It was trapped inside a decision that had been made long before they arrived. The second illusion to die was that the damage was recent. As containment tightened and retreat vanished, the coalition did what it always did when control slipped. It turned inward, digging through data for leverage. If the humans were still present, then patterns would exist, supply chains, command hierarchies, population centers. Something to pressure, something to threaten. They found none of that. What they found instead were records. Not broadcasts. No warnings. Archives. The first was uncovered by a Kelt analysis drone skimming the event horizon of a collapsed system. Embedded in the gravitational noise was a data lattice, compressed, shielded, and deliberately buried deep enough that only catastrophic mass redistribution would expose it. A time capsule, triggered by annihilation. Once decoded, it wasn't a message meant for outsiders. It was a ledger. System name. Population count. Cultural classification. Archive status. Status, sacrificed. At first, analysts assumed it was symbolic, a human affectation, melodramatic phrasing from a dead species. Then they found another. And another. As more systems collapsed under human protocols, more ledgers surfaced, each one older than the last. Some dated back tens of thousands of years. Others were only centuries younger than humanity's disappearance from galactic affairs. Each told the same story. These systems were not lost in war. They gave up. The first ledger Kale fully decoded listed a world called New Tasman. Population, 4.3 billion. The entry noted 3 centuries of preparation. Births limited, immigration encouraged, cultural artifacts digitized and transmitted outward. By the time the system was primed, only caretakers remained. The final log entry was a single word, complete. No apology, no regret, just confirmation that the procedure had been followed. One record detailed the sterilization of a fully inhabited world. Billions evacuated over generations, ecosystems dismantled piece by piece, the planet rendered inert before its star was primed for collapse. Another described the deliberate erasure of an entire cultural archive network, libraries, memory vaults, neural preserves, destroyed because their mass interfered with a future gravitational alignment calculation. The language was clinical, procedural. There was no triumph in it, only acceptance. They planned this, Analyst Third Kale said, their voice stripped of disbelief now, replaced by something harder. Not just the defenses, the losses. The council chambers filled with unease. The prevailing assumption that humans had overbuilt in fear, then vanished, could no longer stand. This wasn't paranoia. This was a follow-through. They didn't just prepare to lose territory, Vorin said slowly. They prepared to lose themselves. That was the illusion collapsing, the belief that survival instinct scaled with intelligence. Every major species in the coalition operated on the same foundational logic. Risk increased with desperation, but only up to a threshold. Beyond that, collapse followed. No rational mind destroyed what it needed to exist. Humanity had built doctrine around crossing that threshold on purpose. The ledgers made it clear this wasn't a last stand. It was a maintenance cycle. Records showed staggered sacrifices across millennia. Entire regions systematically abandoned, dismantled, or annihilated to maintain perimeter geometry. Human populations are shrinking not from defeat, but from design. Each loss is calculated to buy certainty. They weren't trying to win, Kale said. They were trying to make sure no one else could. Anger replaced confusion in the council. This is madness, one delegate spat. They crippled themselves. Burned their future. Yes, Kale replied. And they did it repeatedly, which means they valued the outcome more than survival. That outcome was now clear. The exclusion zone was not meant to be held forever by a thriving humanity. It was meant to function without them. Another archive surfaced, this one not tied to a collapsing system, but drifting freely in a dead corridor. Its encryption took longer to break. When it did, the room went quiet. It was a projection, human strategic modeling spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Branching timelines, invasion vectors, probabilistic contact scenarios. In nearly every branch, humanity did not survive. In all of them, the perimeter did. They had planned for extinction as a viable operational state. The emotional shift was palpable. Fear, yes, but also rage. They condemned entire generations of their own people. Vorin snarled, something breaking in their voice. For what? To deny space. To deny us, Kale answered. And anyone like us. This was not a noble sacrifice. The archives did not dress it up as such. They recorded resistance, dissent, and collapse. Entire factions that fought the policy and lost. Civil unrest resolved not by compromise, but by time, by outlasting opposition through sheer institutional momentum. Humanity hadn't agreed unanimously. It had endured disagreement until only the policy remained. That, too, carried a cost. Estimate remaining assets. Trek ordered quietly. The question carried weight now. If humanity had already burned so much, what was left? Analysts compiled the data. Stellar mass still primed but untriggered. Regions deliberately left intact. Energy reservoirs untouched by millennia of sacrifice. The answer was not comforting. Enough, Kale said. Enough stars. Enough systems. Enough pre-authorized protocols. Enough to escalate far beyond the current containment. The strategic shock landed with full force. Humanity had not exhausted itself defending the border. It had paced itself. Whatever remained beyond the flotilla's sensors, whatever final measures had not yet been invoked, were not remnants scraping by. They were reserves. Held back, waiting for a condition humanity had always assumed would come eventually. The council fell silent, the weight of the realization settling in. They were not facing a dead species' last defenses. They were standing inside the opening phase of a plan that had already accepted the loss of everything else. The change did not announce itself with violence. There was no explosion, no sudden collapse, no immediate loss of ships. That was what made it worse. Across human space, everywhere, simultaneously, ancient beacons awakened. Coalition sensors picked them up as a uniform signal bloom, emerging from systems that had previously been silent, from debris fields, from collapsed stars, from regions that should no longer have supported coherent emissions. The signal was not broadcast outward. It was declared inward. A lattice of confirmations rippled through human space at light speed, each node acknowledging receipt, validating sequence, locking state. Trek watched the display with the hollow sensation of watching an execution they'd already been sentenced to, but hadn't known about until the blade began to fall. Analyst Third Kale froze as the pattern resolved. This is not escalation, they said. This is commitment. Admiral Tresk demanded clarity. Explain. Kale's voice was tight. They've initiated a final protocol. Not conditional. Not reactive. It does not wait for outcomes. The words that followed carried no comfort. It cannot be stopped. The council chambers erupted. Shut it down, one delegate shouted. Counter signal. Override the authorization. Another snarled. Find the control locus. There's always a command node. There is no locus, Kale said, voice flat with the certainty of it. The system is distributed. Fully distributed. That was the horror of it. Humanity was not deciding now. Humanity had decided long ago, and simply reached the line in their own script where the next action occurred. The beacons resolved into visible structures as the flotilla's sensors adjusted, vast constructs unfurling from dormant states, some kilometers wide, others little more than geometric scars in space-time. They were positioned not to attack ships, but to interact with the underlying fabric of reality itself. Gravitational anchors, causality sinks, stellar ignition frames. The models were updated. Projected outcome: permanent alteration of a galactic sector. Not destruction in the conventional sense. No explosion that could be rebuilt from. A rewriting. Humanity was preparing to collapse a volume of space so thoroughly that transit, communication, and even observation would become impossible across it. A dead zone not because nothing existed there, but because existence itself became unstable. A wall made of absence. This will affect regions outside the exclusion zone, Tresk said. Trade routes. Populated systems. Yes, Kale replied. That is why it was reserved. Anger surged through the council. They're holding the galaxy hostage, Vorin hissed. They'd rather cripple everyone than allow entry. No, Kale corrected. They're following policy. That distinction mattered to humans. It meant nothing to those about to suffer the consequences. Emergency channels flared as coalition governments finally grasped the scale of what was happening. Long-range observatories confirmed it within minutes. The beacons were not isolated. They formed a boundary arc spanning light years. A no-return line. Orders flooded in, contradictory, frantic. Withdraw immediately. Disable the beacons at all costs. Open negotiations. Prepare evacuation of adjacent sectors. None of it mattered. Engineering teams confirmed what the analysts already knew. The protocol was locked. Each beacon confirmed the others. Any attempt to interfere triggered local collapse events. Not weapons, but self-erasure. You could not attack the system without accelerating it. Negotiation requests went unanswered, not because humans refused to speak, but because there was no one left to receive them. No channel opened. No reply came. Humanity has removed itself from the loop. Evacuation orders were issued across border regions as panic spread. Civilian traffic clogged hyperspace lanes. Entire habitats attempted emergency relocations. Timelines failed immediately. The projected alteration zone expanded faster than ships could flee. Not as a wave, but as a growing incompatibility. Regions where hyperspace solutions no longer resolved, where navigation equations diverged wildly. Space was becoming uncooperative. They planned for this too. Kale said, quieter now. The delays. The panic. The failure. The beacons changed state again. A new signal layer overlaid the old, simpler, stripped of encryption. It was never meant to be secret. It was meant to be seen. A countdown. Not synchronized to coalition clocks, but to something deeper. Pulsar triangulation, decay rates of specific isotopes, quantum foam fluctuations that did not drift across stellar time. An absolute measure. Time remaining until phase completion. The number was large by battlefield standards. It was terrifyingly small compared to the galactic ones. This is a point of no-return protocol, Kale said. Once the threshold is crossed, rollback is impossible, even if humanity wants it. And if they're already gone? Tresk asked. Kale didn't answer immediately. When they did, their voice carried the weight of the realization. Then this is what they left behind to finish the job. The flotilla drifted in a tightening cage of altered space, watching the numbers tick down, each increment a confirmation that the universe was moving toward a state no one else had chosen, but everyone would have to live with. Humanity had not issued a warning. It had issued a deadline, and the galaxy was already running out of time. The galaxy watched. That, more than anything else, marked the shift. In the hours after the countdown appeared, observation arrays across 100 civilizations reoriented toward human space. Not out of curiosity, out of necessity. Trade halted. Military deployments froze in place. Even ongoing wars stalled as commanders realized that nothing they were fighting over would matter if the exclusion zone finished what it had begun. For the first time since humanity vanished, everyone was paying attention. And what they saw terrified them. From non-human perspectives, the pattern finally resolved. Not as a series of traps or escalations, but as a philosophy encoded into infrastructure. The collapsing systems, the destabilized corridors, the beacons rewriting space itself. None of it was reactive in the way other species understood conflict. There was no attempt to win. There was only an attempt to end the game. Coalition analysts, now joined by independent observers and rival powers, compared notes in open data forums. Models updated in real time as new collapses occurred, not violent now, but subtle. Regions of space where equations stopped converging, where prediction itself failed. A senior physicist from the Orine Compact said it first, quietly, during a broadcast that cut through the noise. Humanity did not build these systems to defeat enemies, she said. They built them to survive being irrelevant. The statement spread faster than any warning. The realization followed. Humanity's advantage was not technological supremacy. Others had surpassed them in raw power long ago. It was coordination under loss. Every other civilization treated self-destruction as a failure state, a condition to be avoided until all other options were exhausted. Humanity had inverted that logic. They had engineered systems that assumed loss of territory, of population, of culture, and functioned better because of it. They didn't escalate despite the cost. They escalated because they had already paid for it. What they held back, said another analyst, wasn't capability. It was timing. The exclusion zone had never been a fortress. It was a fuse. Human space was not meant to be defended indefinitely. The records made that clear now. The sacrifices, the pacing, the reserves. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. If challenged beyond a threshold, humanity would remove the contested space entirely and accept whatever followed. That threshold had been crossed. Outside the zone, fear took on new forms. Strategists realized their doctrines were obsolete. Deterrence failed against an opponent who didn't value survival the same way. Containment failed when the container was designed to burn. Negotiation failed when there was no one left to negotiate with. Even the concept of victory lost meaning. In one border system, a planetary council voted to abandon its orbit rather than risk being caught in the alteration zone's expansion. Billions began a forced migration, not because of invasion, but because of proximity. They were moving away from nothing. Inside the flotilla, the mood curdled into quiet horror. No orders came from command anymore. There was nothing left to order. Ships conserved power and watched the countdown tick toward a number that meant nothing and everything at once. Analyst Third Kale no longer spoke unless asked. When they did, it was only to confirm what everyone already feared. The final protocol is approaching execution state, they said during the last full briefing. All indicators are green. Is there any variance left? Admiral Tresk asked. Kale checked the streams. The beacons were steady. The lattice was complete. No, they said. Humanity accounted for deviation. This is the cleanest path. Outside, observation arrays registered a shift, not energetic, not spatial, but informational. A deep quiet settled over the zone as background emissions dropped away. Even cosmic noise seemed to thin. It was the silence before a system completed its last calculation. Across the galaxy, transmissions slowed. Words failed. No one wanted to be the last to speak before something fundamental changed. The countdown reached its final interval. And then, nothing happened. No explosion. No light. Just a sudden, profound absence of further data. Humanity was done holding back. The galaxy held its breath. The execution did not begin. It was resolved. Across the exclusion zone, every human beacon reached zero simultaneously, not because they were synchronized, but because they had always been counting toward the same constant. When the last interval elapsed, the lattice did not activate a weapon. It finalized a state. Space changed. Not violently. Not explosively. It simply stopped behaving. Within the defined volume, an irregular, light-year-spanning region that now encompassed the flotilla and the inner human perimeter. Fundamental relationships unraveled. Hyperspace solutions collapsed first, their equations diverging into noise. Drives attempting emergency jumps failed without feedback, as if the destination no longer existed in a form that could be reached. Then real space followed. Stars did not go supernova. They dimmed, their fusion processes throttled by altered constants until light itself struggled to escape. In one pocket, a crew watched their instruments age centuries in subjective seconds. In another, a ship's hull crystallized as molecular bonds reinterpreted themselves under new rules. Gravitational fields twisted asymmetrically, no longer obeying inverse square laws. Time dilation spiked unpredictably, seconds stretching into hours in some pockets. compressing to nothing in others. Navigation ceased to function. Sensors returned contradictions. Matter held shape only where it already existed. The flotilla was caught mid-thought. Ships that attempted to maneuver found inertia behaving selectively. Thrusters fired, but momentum failed to propagate cleanly. Hulls groaned as stress accumulated unevenly across frames designed for a universe that no longer applied. Some vessels tore themselves apart trying to move. Others simply froze, trapped in regions where time had slowed to near standstill. Crews locked in moments that would never meaningfully progress. Communication ended next. Signals entered the altered region and did not emerge. Not jammed, not absorbed, incompatible. The invading coalition ceased to exist as a coherent entity, not through destruction, but through isolation so total that recovery was no longer a meaningful concept. From outside the zone, observers watched the boundary finalize. It did not glow. It did not flare. It simply refused interaction. Probes sent toward it vanished without telemetry. Long-range scans returned nulls where data should have been. Attempts to map the region produced paradoxes, coordinates that could not be reconciled, distances that changed depending on how they were measured. Human space was no longer empty. It was unreachable. The last remaining coalition command node, adrift near the boundary, engines disabled by distorted physics, managed one final burst transmission before its systems failed entirely. The message was not a warning. It was an observation. Boundary condition complete, it reported, voice fractured by interference. No viable vectors. No survivable states. The threat has been. The signal was cut out. Inside the altered region, the countdown beacons extinguished themselves. Their purpose fulfilled, they collapsed into inert mass, then into nothing at all as the new constants rejected their structure. There were no human ships arriving. No final declaration. No confirmation of victory. Because there was no longer a battlefield. The main threat, the incursion, the assumption that the boundary could be tested, was ended not by defeat, but by removal from the universe in which threats could operate. Human space was no longer defended. It was absolute. The immediate aftermath rippled outward. Trade lanes bordering the zone failed permanently, forcing emergency rerouting that destabilized entire economies. Border systems went dark as power grids reliant on human space gravity anchors collapsed. Billions were displaced, not by war, but by geometry. Strategic maps were rewritten in real time, a vast region replaced by a simple marker. And interactable. The flotilla was gone, not destroyed in a way that could be mourned or avenged, just unreachable. And the exclusion zone, once a warning no one believed, had become a fact no one could challenge. The universe adjusted around it. Humanity did not need to be present anymore. The execution was complete. The maps changed first. Not ceremonially. Not all at once. One by one, across thousands of navigation authorities, academic institutions, trade consortiums, and military archives, cartographers removed detail from a region they could no longer describe. Human space was no longer shaded. No longer marked as restricted, hazardous, or unknown. It became a void, a clean absence where data refused to hold. Coordinates that could be referenced but not resolved. Distances that could be measured only up to the boundary, then failed. Some maps labeled it null region. Others used older language, absolute exclusion. Most stopped naming it at all. What mattered was that it could not be crossed. The galaxy adapted the only way it could, by bending around the impossible. Trade routes that had once skimmed the edge of human space were abandoned entirely. Entire economic blocks collapsed and reformed along new axes. Worlds that had depended on those corridors withered or migrated, their populations forced into slow, grinding resettlement not by conquest, but by physics. Military doctrine fractured. Deterrence models were rewritten from the ground up. No longer could planners assume an opponent sought victory, survival, or even dominance. A new category entered the strategic lexicon, rarely discussed, never invoked lightly. Terminal actors. Species capable of converting their own destruction into enforcement. Humanity became the archetype. Academies taught the case not as history, but as boundary conditions. Cadets studied the exclusion zone not to learn how to fight humans, but to learn why fighting them had ceased to be a meaningful concept. You could not threaten a civilization that had already threatened itself more thoroughly than you ever could. You could not invade a region designed to be erased rather than occupied. And you could not negotiate with a policy that had outlived its makers and still executed flawlessly. There were debates, of course. Some argued humanity had been monstrous. Others insisted it had been rational. A few fringe philosophies even praised the elegance of the solution. None of that mattered. What mattered was behavior. No probe crossed the boundary again. Not out of fear of weapons, but out of certainty of outcome. The exclusion zone did not expand. It did not retaliate further. It simply remained, a silent fact embedded in the structure of the galaxy. Humanity did not return. No ships emerged. No messages followed. No proof surfaced that anyone remained alive within the unreachable volume of space they had claimed. But their influence endured, not as culture, not as empire, not even as memory. As a constraint. As a limit written into reality. As the one example no strategist could afford to forget. 50 years later, a junior analyst at the Orine Strategic Academy would uncover one final human document, a personal log, and signed, dated 3 centuries before the perimeter's activation. It read, "We're voting tomorrow. The measure will pass. I know the counts. My children will be among the first generations relocated. They'll never see the worlds I grew up on. Neither will I, once the timers are set. Someone will ask, eventually, if this was worth it, if the cost was justified. I can't answer that. But I can tell you what we're afraid of. That if we don't do this, no one will. That if we leave even one door open, someone will walk through it assuming we've given permission. That our absence will be taken as an invitation. We're not trying to win. We're trying to make sure that when we're gone, we're still understood." The document was filed in the Academy's archives under Ethics Case Study 1847, The Completeness Problem. It was never assigned as required reading. Students found it anyway. No one enters human space. Not because they might die, but because humanity already proved it would.